Hello everyone, today we talk about the Syrian infantry of the crusading era. This is an underrated topic, as far as I know also relatively understudied depending on the documentation that we have. That's naturally scarcer compared to, say, what was happening in Western Europe. But it's an important chapter in the history of the Levant, of Syria more specifically. It was not just actually about that. This type of infantry organization and quality that we will appreciate extended also across the Jazeera. It pertained to the Iraqi cities as well. Just we know too few about those because the Islamic world does not develop and document in ways that, in fact, mirror also a lesser degree of infantry relevance in the local art of war compared to the Western one. At the same time, there is a context, right, of militarization, especially in the Syrian cities, that had been, like, throughout this period, like between the Byzantines, the Seljuks, the Crusaders, experiencing a great deal, in fact, of fighting and fortification, also obsidianal development as far as, for example, the siege technologies are concerned, machinery, etc. There was all a tradition before that. You know, the Chinese, for example, imported in their military might in the previous centuries had imported Arab military engineers to have their artillery work. So it's a very fascinating context. We discussed actually the Ahdath, talking regional warfare, in fact, of Syria, the Jazeera, and Iraq between the 11th and the 14th century. That, as we will see now, is also like the chronological parabola of the Ahdath development in existence. This can't be comparable to some Western developments because at least this is the peak of the great medieval civilization for everyone involved. There was a lot of contact with the West. We have seen, for example, in recent videos how the Yanuviya shield was a thing, especially in this area. Yanuviya meaning Genoese, right? And in fact, used as an Arab term to describe certain shields with a flat bottom to essentially, if not fixed, just to rest on the ground, similar to the ones that the Italians used. And, you know, the Latins were just the enemies of the same people. What is interesting, of course, is that in the Levant, as we've seen some videos about, for example, the organization of the Jerusalem forces, there were militias, right, in the, say, Levantine towns that did historically have an important urban tradition, of course, providing with this kind of militia, but not knowing for the Crusader states, for example, how effective these were and how, say, represented they are in the sources, given sort of the prevalent Frankish disdain towards the footmen, the commoners in general. This is a problem also in Europe, at least in the ways this, you know, eventually these elements of the army were represented. In the Islamic world, there was less sort of, it's actually debatable. Maybe there wasn't actually even less stigma, at least from a Turkish perspective, as we have seen, especially these parts of northern parts of the Fertile Crescent were dominated by Seljuk warfare, and of course, whereas we'll see now pinches of Byzantine, Kurdish influence, etc. But of course, the main armies that the Crusaders faced in this region were essentially composed by cavalry. They were like this Middle Eastern, if not properly Central Asian influence, straight from the Seljuk background, armies of emirs and askaris. I made a video about the latter specifically as a historical unit type. And so when you look at Syria, Iraq, the Jazeera, you realize that their infantries were developed, as we will see now, but they were, however, subordinated to dismounted contingents. There is actually here and there, and in also in around the same time, but also in the previous centuries, of course, all a type of infantry development that partially resembles the one of, in fact, the part of Europe exposed to the steppe, just like the Middle East, the Levant was very much tormented by all these, especially Central Asian waves, right, of invasion. Say a strengthening of, in fact, the urban militias, and especially their equipment, visibly oriented to cope with cavalry and horse archery, also more specifically. So it wasn't just like a stopping power capacity that is proper for heavy infantry, but also the need to counter with missiles. And as we'll see now, the same Syrian infantry would develop crossbows, which is absolutely normal for also the Islamic world in general, but that seemed to have been sort of more disciplined and specialized in that, especially between the 12th and the 13th century. Also in here, it's a normal development. Also in Western Europe, you had basically the same timeline of the preponderance of the crossbow. But let's say there were some parts of the Islamic world that were sort of wilder and more habituated to horse archery, if anything. Consider also this, and I have, in a couple of months, we will make a video about the properly Egyptian warfare during this time, that the Levant, Syria especially, were, say, militarily speaking, very influenced by, say, the West as a whole. Like if you look at Egyptian, Syrian, Levantine armies in general, these were sort of historically much more differently from the Middle East, right? Mesopotamia even, that had received a lot of that more Persian and at this point Turkish influence. These were sort of much more sort of foot-based armies, right? The cities were normally, say, it was a greater fabric of urbanization, right? In the Middle East, you had great cities, very important ones. Baghdad was the largest in the Islamic world as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. It was a hell of a deal, but the more you shift towards the east, the northeast, you have even massive cities like Merv, it was said, actually would be the largest in the world before the Mongols razed it to the ground in the 12th century, but being sort of more isolated, right, into a world that is very close to the steppe, is very often like sort of a hybrid between the things that are sort of oases, caravan stops, etc. All the area of Egypt, the Levant, sort of resembles a lot more, like compare especially to the Seljuk Turks, like paradoxically a European army to some extent. We appreciate it in multiple videos, and we will be even more explicit about this, talking about the Ayyubids. This is actually even before that, especially the Fatimids, because the Ayyubids were bringing already just like that Kurdish, Turkic bias to that, but more cavalry also with the Mamluks. There is a great decline during the 14th century, as we've seen, of a lot of things because of the general crisis of the medieval civilization, and especially in this region, the Mongolization warfare that is much more sort of literally raising civilization to the ground at this initially, and so dismantling, destructuring the urban bases that, if you look at in perspective, are definitely the product of a Romano-Sasanian background that eventually the Arabs had inherited. And this is the point. These were essentially Arab, meant in a linguistic sense, of course. At least in these areas, there were Semitic peoples who were sort of basically part of the broader world the Arabs too belonged. And these are, in fact, also areas, this is the Fertile Crescent, that again have a very old urbanization historically, in spite of all the various destabilizations, etc. And there is this ethnic tension that does result within the cities in a political one between, in fact, the local establishment, the city establishment proper, and the new lords that come in the form of the Turks in fact, to rule over them. And in fact, this is perhaps, today we don't talk too much about this, but the actual importance of the Ahdath, military speaking as well, because these were forces who were sort of meant to oppose the general iron fist of the Seljuk domination, and that in fact the Turks had to be very wary of, especially in this sort of more westernmost frontiers. Right, Syria was more urbanized than, say, Anatolia. Right. At the same time, we noticed that the Syrian infantry wasn't really as developed. Like, for how developed it really was, it would be really interesting to make a comparison with other parts of the Islamic world. This was definitely one of the areas in which these infantry were more dynamic and tough, and stemming from, in part, the autonomization in these frontier areas, as we've seen lots of warfare, and this is still, like, a region crossed by the major axis of the Silk Road, so they make money, right? They're a bit like the Italians of the Near East, but this is the point, not to the extent that would allow these infantries and these polities in general to step further, in fact, in any comparable ways to what you see in the West. We even have a problem with seeing them in action. I made a video, for example, about the Battle of XI-XIII, the Field of Blood, fought in 1119, right, between Roger of Antioch, and so we're talking exactly about Syria, and against the Turks, right, the Ilghazi of Mardin specifically. And so a context in which we do know, being there from the Crusader side, at least certainly, native Syrian infantry, right? Ibn al-Kalanizi reports specifically that the Antiochians would have totaled also 20,000 men, which is a very large force for, like, the modest possibilities of Antioch. But if you have to quantify sort of that scale of in the tens of thousands, you would imagine actually being there local urban militias. Of course, there were Armenians, Turcopoles. We will see how now the same Ahdath, by say approximation, could contain some non-Arab elements, right? Ethnic Greeks, right? Byzantines, because this is what that's what land had belonged to, and Kurds as well. However, in essence, this infantry forces would have also looked fairly similar. You know that Syria is surrounded by, also, like in the north, there are mountains, etc. So that's exactly where those other sort of lighter hit-and-run, sort of harassing infantries of mountaineers had historically come from. Anatolia, and especially in the surroundings, was one of the sort of, say, nests of all the scum, basically, of the Islamic world in terms of heretics, of extremists, of, in fact, quite very fanatic warriors that would later, think about the Ghazis, etc. Like, that was especially pertaining to a wilder Anatolian background. The Syrians were more refined, right? They had this urban civilization, and you notice, and today we don't talk, unfortunately, about that either, that there was a great deal of fortification, right? Robust structures. Here we mentioned Antioch, for example, but there were other important centers that had historically had managed to enclose themselves within these walls. And this is something that we've seen actually in other parts of the formerly Byzantine-controlled areas. For example, in southern Italy, there were surely the strongest militias of the first half of the 11th century Byzantine Empire. Eventually, the Normans arrived there, and they choke their autonomies. Right? This is a bit what the Seljuks do here, except the Normans have a much bulkier state in southern Italy than the Seljuks have in the Levant. right? And so this allows a bit for the Ahdath to be seen in some, actually even more advanced ways that in fact other feudal areas of the world. In any case, making to millimetric comparison maybe is not that useful. What is useful in here is sort of understanding the mindset of these forces. First of all, it's not fair to say that the Ahdath urban infantries were passive or demilitarized troops, right? They were actually propositive. They would set forth from the city gates, not, however, just as infantry. Of course, there was always cavalry next to them. It wasn't an opposition. It wasn't a level of, say, societal, of estate strength to the point of having an infantry that simply goes out there alone. This is rare historically and sort of doesn't make sense. This, however, doesn't mean that these infantries were in fact capable of withstanding like a great deal of pressure, like for example the heavy cavalry shock. In the same battle of the Ager Sanguinis that we mentioned before, for example, we know that there was some Syrian infantry, but we do not know what they did in battle. In that case, for that matter, of course, the Turks would have had the corresponding equivalent to that. So this Ahdath would have surely witnessed, they would have surely received the Latin heavy cavalry charges into their ranks. And we can imagine, of course, how throughout the Crusade centuries this sort of heavier shock tactics were surely contributing to develop also the local military environment. At the same time, we again don't see this infantry doing anything independently. Right? If anything, they would have defended the city walls during sieges, fought around also to make order, like in the city district and surroundings. I don't think much beyond like a few tens of kilometers from the center. And if they were to be led at greater distances, of course, they would have done so within a broader army, again, of the Crusader Seljuk type. All right. However, the most interesting aspect of these militias is that they had a degree of semi-professionalism that should not be underestimated. This also doesn't necessarily mean that the overall quality and its compactness of the infantry would have developed accordingly. For example, we see this infantry frequently mentioned between the 10th and the 12th centuries, the Ahdath specifically. And then we understand that the lack of documentation later on implies the probable decline of the institution per se, right? The institution revolved around a literal pay of these troops through the taxes collected by the community. Now, the 13th century, as we know, is a moment of severe blow due to the Mongol invasion, so there is actually nothing strange about the decay of the urban system, as we were saying before. Anyhow, between the 12th and the 13th century at the same time, we see that some elements within the Ahdath, such as the Nafta grenades throwers and the crossbowmen, that are, as we'll see now, mentioned more frequently, would have been paid as regulars, as some sort of like even professional force, or at least semi-professional, in the sense that yes, they would have been paid, but only when there was actually war, not because they were perennially having this source of military experience, right? They would have been kept supplied and organized by the same community that was that expressed it, militarily speaking. But that's it. This is interesting to compare also with Western developments, because Western infantry, you see, there is the so-called Islamic Golden Age, which, let's say, shouldn't be overly, as you know, overly exalted, but it wasn't even just like the, say, non-accomplishment that my fellow conservatives sometimes don't talk about. There was some important civilizational stability, and in the 10th century, like, some Islamic infantries were really interesting, like, for the general standards of the time. Again, nothing. Probably that was also a time in which there was less cavalry warfare injected properly in, if you want, a more archaic Arab world that we're still living it, but as a legacy of the Roman and Persian system in the Caliphal era, like exactly this region, Syria, Iraq, and we have this earlier decay, right? These centuries are 11 to 12 also a moment of gradual feudalization, reprivatization at least of the system because of the Seljuk injection. You know that the Saint Turks had the XI system. This was present also in Egypt. It was like the pronoia. We were talking about that the other day in the video about the Komnenians, because the same thing was happening in the Byzantine world. It was like wasn't a fully feudal system like the Western one. The Western one that knew also a communal development in parallel to the same, which is in fact showing you how more punching both cavalry and infantry in the West really were, and how effective, in fact, they were in the same Levant against these other forces, their equivalent. And this does bring, of course, overall, like, the Islamic world had not known communalism. They wouldn't know that, right? But to some, at least, autonomization, it's some centers like this exploit in order to be also more self-reliant, military speaking. So you don't have to exceed, like, in the actual quality of these guys. The aforementioned sort of professionalism or semi-professionalism of some specialists, like naphtha throwers or crossbowmen, actually mirrors some things that are happening in the West, like mounted crossbowmen, foot crossbowmen are paid, for example, by the communal militias sort of more than the other infantry, because they seem to have had some even sort of semi-permanence, because they were specialists you needed to use quite scientifically. They were also a few overall. The bulk of the forces was provided by the citizenry, and so speaking of citizenry for a Syrian context like here, it's too much. Like, there isn't, as we were saying before, that sense of political liberty, if not de facto independence, that you find in the European communes, and so also the infantries, even the cavalries for that matter, all the various specialties and how they amalgamated together in the West, you don't really find here, right? But of course, all elements had warfare was not tremendously different, and so aside from the quality, you see basically the same dynamics going on, right? And after this period, it does seem really that the Ahdath declined during the 13th to the 14th centuries, possibly merging with or becoming known as the Aghnad, which stands for the unit, this military division, which became applied to Arab military districts that had already been a thing during the Caliphate. Now at least, as you know, the Mongols forfeited it, and most notably, and this is why it's relevant, to the provinces into which Greater Syria, so the Levant, was divided. So there is some. This happens in the West as well. Like, the communal militias decline during the second half of the 14th century because of the great crisis of medieval civilization. But it's not like they disappear. They're always there. The institution is always the same. The principle is always the same. These are the most elementary forms of basic levy of males. Like Ahdath, by the way, literally means young men, right? So it's based on the sense of also of corporatism, like the young manliness in Syria. They were often based on the futuwa, this quasi-political factions, right? So comparable also to the Ayarun and Fitian of Iraq. In fact, there were, as we said since the beginning, very great similarities between them. And this is interesting because this concept stems from actually a more chivalric, or at least the Islamic version of chivalry, and sort of also still warband and youthfulness, etc. That is not really something you find in the West. In the West, the communal militias, also the toughest infantry, there are the toughest infantries in the world at this point, are very much like civically oriented. They're popularly oriented. They do know that they are, as citizens, free men in arms, and so they have that sense of nobility and sense of cohesion, etc. But the equivalent, like, of societies of knights, of youthful, like, sort of pack of wolves, etc., pertains mostly to the knights, right? So my take here is that since in the Islamic world you do not really have something like that developed in the same way, if not in the sort of most feudally powerful societies, it is mostly the heavily Persified Seljuk Turks. Some of them are here indeed, but these, remember, are Arabs, are actually countered them. And since there are these warbanders around from the mountains in the north, from Anatolia, from Kurdistan, etc., there is some sort of greater hybrid between that sense of, it's not, these are not really, they don't feel much their citizenry, they feel still more this more privatistic idea of themselves as, say, warriors that live in a city rather than, and so then a citizen is someone participating to this great high sense of state or whatever. At this point in 13th, 14th century, the West has proper city-states, right? These are not city-states. There's something else. They're more like towns. Even when they're bigger cities, they're run by some greater feudal or quasi-feudal lord. And so these militias that are part of the game, and as we've seen, tendentially had opposed them, however, are down. They're not so relevant like in open field. Especially during the 13th to 14th century with the Mongol injection, the sort of this Turco-Mongolification final Turco-Mongolification of Middle Near Eastern warfare. You have, aside from, again, a more sedentary Mediterranean reality, like mostly like cavalry reaffirming itself very potently in this sort of Middle Eastern, Central Asian tradition. And there is where you see the decline of these militias that become something more like, some guilds that controlled parts of the cities, of course, had their own militia, etc., but this doesn't evolve in anything particularly, at least if we look at today's time frame, like anything particularly relevant, as it had just also relatively been before, right? As we explained, the Ahdath wasn't this, major feat in the history of the art of war. They were just like the expression of some, self-aware townsmen that knew definitely how to defend their centers and that would be heavily involved in all the political contrasts and would participate to larger military expeditions for the sake of getting something in return from that. Loot, prestige, cooptation, whatever. And so this is what really matters. Needless to say, when there were cities around, there weren't just militias, but to send in open field, but also in siege warfare. So when you need to, of course, besiege the various centers, you couldn't simply do it with if you were a Seljuk, say, with horse archers, right? You needed these locals to create the screen around the city, to dig in, to fortify, to create siege machinery, artillery. And so there were also all these specialties that we learn of. Aleppo, for example, Damascus also was the other major center appreciated for the Ahdath. These were the major centers in Syria, together with Antioch. Had this, siege engineering capacities that were reflected by the three categories of, specialists drawn from the Ahdath, that were the XI-XIII, that means the artillery crews, the Nakabin, the miners, and the Khorazani, that is the crews for the rams and penthouses. This is very interesting because it definitely sounds similar to like some Western guilds, corporations. Like, of course, you can imagine in these cities, like some quarters having shops, workshops specializing in the creation of, say, artillery, and so that the crews would have been the same technicians who created this stuff and knew how to employ them. You have the miners, the also other specialists able to create battering rams, screens, stuff like that. Of course, we are not entirely sure about what kind of status, duties, and loyalties the Ahdath had. This is how few we know about them after all. There is definitely, however, a military test of their capacity when they, for example, defended the Syrian cities against the Byzantine and Crusader attacks in the 11th and the 12th centuries. Again, their military involvement is antecedent of at least a century at the Crusader era. The Ahdath siege skills, as we've seen, were appreciated. They had this very specialized military engineers, and that were summoned for offensive operations against the Crusader castles that, considering also Western fortifications and military engineering, were not soft nuts to crack. In the early 13th century, the Ahdath of Baghdad, this is not Syria, but just for the record, may have made use of very sophisticated weapons, even though, unfortunately, the terminology is vague. Probably was more vague in Arab than in Latin as far as the West is concerned, and so therefore we know that few about these guys in their role in this. Remember, the most important thing is that these guys were paid by the community. There was properly a part of the city, a town tax, deputed to pay these guys for their service, which makes them some semi-professional force, right? Or in case even professional, depending, especially in this regarding the specialists. We know that because there was a local police that was something different. It was known as the Shurta, and so in that sense, it was just like some sort of paramilitary force. Even though, of course, here we're talking of militia, which in the modern English term refers to, in fact, non-professional force that can be that sort of, squalid and scarce. Of course, there were different type of levies around. In fact, what is important to observe here is that the Ahdath distinguishes itself above the rest of infantry was used also in substantial numbers, especially in the Turkish armies. We see it in the less regularized way. At least the Westerners had their own infantrymen, plus this local militia, urban militiamen from, again, the sort of more Mediterranean, urbanized, and as we've seen also, in fact, less ruthlessly controlled part of the Levant, right? The Turks were not that gentle, but also gathered in a sort of raiding party. Everybody, they found mostly against horsemen, but also infantrymen. And so next to the town militias, there were also, let's say, other auxiliary forces. We talked about the Dailamis, for example, that at the beginning of the period were still like some Iranian Islamic Iranian infantry that from south of the Caspian Sea, that as primitive, brutal, and unsophisticated, was still particularly active, like as mercenaries around the entire Islamic world, which is say at least the western part. Of course, Islam had arrived pretty far east at this point, but that tells you how the same Ahdath would have found themselves often to compete with this sort of much more brutal and fully professional mercenaries at the beginning of this period that were still infantry based in the older sort of Arab tradition. Then when the Seljuks arrive, everything, the entire landscape changes. This would actually bring together with them other tribal irregulars on foot from the mountains of the Mashrek. There would be so many different people. In fact, we shouldn't be thinking of the Ahdath having always been organized or framed or established in the same way. Right? For us, it's difficult even to understand how the institution was founded. So that, as we've seen, we could find them operating in the vicinities of their cities, but also often being used just for siege and even just camp duties, right? And at that point, you realize that, like even the more scattered and less cohesive sort of urban culture of the region, you didn't have some sort of tougher, homogeneous infantry like, one of the Italian communes that were very like one another. They had basically all the same type of organization, all the same type of mentality, of involvement, of armament, whatever. Here it's slightly different. Admittedly, yes, it's 11th, 13th century infantry, doesn't go anywhere in terms of how they could have been armed. We'll see now what their gear was, very basic and obvious, right? What naturally is interesting is how spirited, motivated they were, as we've seen, especially in the defense of their cities. They did well, and especially what kind of political involvement they had with the greater rulers out there. But likely, again, they were something institutionally more evaporating from a military point of view than, say, other institutions that we're more habituated to in the West, right? I think even if I look at, French communal infantry, France being a very heavily feudal country, actually the single most feudal country in Europe, still having some important robustness, and I suspect something that was likely even, of course, tougher than what you could find in the Fertile Crescent, as a matter of fact, regardless of how also in that case, like, population were being subordinated to the feudal elite, etc. But sometimes it's also because we don't really know better. And this is the point with the Ahdath themselves. From the indicators, the hints we get, we can sort of pulse this strength through this, military thermometer, but we don't know anything more, say, official, specific, and we have just to go with this. Maybe, I don't know what's the status of research on this topic. I've read of this normally, like, texts that are at most like 10, 20 years later. I could actually make a video when I find more sources, but that's the point. Like, more or less the sources that we know of are there, and so aside from some scholar that can make a specific research on them, again, of framing the concept better, coming up with some more robust theory, this is more or less what we know. As we said before, especially their tactical involvement would be interesting to observe, to appreciate, but we don't get much about it from the very battle descriptions. Like, very often we've seen it, multiple crusades, battles. It's not like we know what the Islamic infantry was doing, right? We found these exceptions. For example, we've seen at, I think it was the third Ramla. In that case, some Egyptian, say, Ayyubid-led Sudanese infantry coming from Black Africa, actually withstanding for an entire day before breaking, actually, finally collapsing. Through combined arms of spears and longbows, Frankish cavalry charges. I mean, and those warriors were the Sudanese mercenaries were savages, basically. But they were so loaded and so tough that they actually withstood the Latin charges. That's utterly insane, right? About the sturdiness, the resistance of this infantry. And you see, Egypt would have had similar militias urban militias to the Syrian ones. We will perhaps look at this again in some more specific videos. We'll talk more about medieval Egyptian warfare. But you could still find this, like the Dailamis that we just mentioned, or other forces that, for example, like the Ayyubids, how they had began with Kurdish forces. Like there was a substantial amount of infantry coming from there, and those Kurds were again tougher, savager than, at least in an individual sense, than the average Ahdath trooper. Except this Ahdath seems to have, this is really the interesting aspect of it, a higher degree of collective training, of organization, of also supply, logistical sort of basing, right? So they weren't like tribesmen living in some valley. They really had some interesting range. So it's interesting, almost cozy to think like of all the terrifying things happening here, like the Crusades, the Mongols, whatever. You are sort of attached to your own, if you want, a bit decadent town that, however, has, I don't know, is in rock somewhere, and it still has, stone walls. Your community has the capacity of replacing that, and you have some internal organization, some tactical specialization, as we've seen, some wealth, some surplus, and so somebody would have ruled over you, but you would have still made yourself felt at that political and military level to say, look, our society here is important. If you want to rule, you have to agree on us, right? We don't, like, especially in the later Middle Ages, we mostly witness some kind of professionalization, some mercenary forces. Like, those areas would never be about particularly, say, tough or numerous field infantries, right? It's mostly just like cavalry, as we were saying before. And that's a real discriminant here, right? There's too much cavalry around for this infantry to be effective. And that is measured also, you see, if you look at the Franks, that, as we were saying before, had a dominant cavalry as well, but they had infantries that were developing in parallel, and even at home sort of competing with cavalry in a sense. You realize how sort of actually non-punching the Ahdath was in comparison to those, right? Because Frankish cavalry was essentially a pair superior to the Islamic ones, and if say those local infantries, Islamic infantry, were not capable of basically in open field of opposing either, because I don't know any. I just was struck by the Sudanese there, but in fact, this other local Syrian Semitic militias, like I can't mention like one example of their particular resistance or say dynamism, some aggressiveness. They may have been good, right? I mean, these are infantries you can rely on, again, for all these interesting tasks. Like you put them behind city walls, they widely amplify their effectiveness. They're very good at that. They know how to repair the walls, how to counter the enemy siege machinery. They're good, right? They're basic minimum you rely on with other forces to eventually launch sorties and making coordinated attacks. And in open field, they sort of provide you essentially with, at least if you have to besiege a city, like the numerically and sort of skillfully necessary manpower and labor force to operate. establish a camp, to just to operate the siege machinery, etc. And in open field, really, truly in pitched battles, perhaps not too much. But it's also true that we don't see those in action. So do not underestimate them too, because if you remember this, that if there was infantry out there, they took them into a campaign, and even if they were sort of better used as again siege sappers or whatever, it's not just that, right? They were also looking at their numbers, their deployment, heavy infantry, and as such, even though it's not particularly clear in this cavalry-dominated warfare from the Islamic side, also numerically how infantry interacted precisely with cavalry from a tactical point of view, they still were heavy infantry, and they performed that. Again, they would have not stood their ground alone. They would have not just simply gone there to die either. Remember the conflict existing between them and those who have brought them to these enterprises. They're useful in many ways. There is infantry, it's used, it's normal. Just we can't see too well exactly how they were employed tactically wise. As we were saying before, the Syrian infantry armament would be sort of the most typical. Here we're talking by average, of course. I don't know how many other videos we will make on, say, a heavier type of infantryman, because at that point we would be talking about someone, especially in this context, tending to be engaged in mounted warfare, like the kind of let's say involvement, especially of this local urban elites into, say, Seljuk policy, also as the same leaders, the same guildsmen, the same lords. Here again, it's all blurred in terms of formal roles, but these were the people on which the same militia depended on largely. Like if they were probably from the city, and they would have our control. So this population would have preferentially fought again on horseback. Would have joined also as being co-opted by the Seljuks, that sort of more, in fact, Turkish Persian lifestyle, right? Chivalry, and we've seen how the same concept behind the Ahdath was this sort of youthful, like, springing of, like, the hero of the thing. So it's definitely there, and I can't think necessarily of a subtype of heavier infantryman. It surely existed, right? But we can't specifically, like, point out as so iconic or characteristic. Nevertheless, also his armament would have not radically changed. It's all very simple. The fairly typical armament that we can think of, also probably because we don't have too many iconographic or documentary evidence, but a Syrian militiaman would comprise chiefly of poor arms and armor. Remember, here we're talking the average. We're not talking even the aforementioned naphtha throwers or crossbowmen that would have been sort of characteristically important. We will make perhaps some videos about those, right? Because they're really interesting, and they could have been found prevalently, I would say, in this region within this very Ahdath militias. But of course, other Islamic lords would have just had their own means, right, to field such troops. And as we've seen, that boundary here, politically and socially, was pretty blurred, so that's not much. But that's much more technical, and so we'll talk about those weapons, right? But the average guy, after all, was not particularly performing, right? Consider that here we sort of focused more on the guys living within the city gates that were naturally more affluent, but the majority of them would have actually come from the surrounding district. All right, so they were just peasants, farmers, nothing particularly combative just per se. Of course, they would have known how to defend their house, their family from incursions, from, like, when Turkish armies put themselves in motion again. There was all this scum of the earth coming from God knows where on the bowels of Central Asia, even just knowing, right? The Seljuks were moving for a regional campaign, and these people were just there for the loot. They, of course, didn't care about anything about the local population. There would be thieves, murderers, rapists, and whatever. And so, of course, this Syrian population would have been sort of habituated to even those kind of issues. And generally speaking, their equipment would have been pretty scarce, as it was normal for the average medieval infantryman. Anyway, right? This is true also, generally speaking, in Europe for the average, right? It was higher, right, than what we see here. But let's say this is the point that, especially, say, the more you increase the collective effectiveness of these forces, actually the least armored the forces must be. At least, like, there is all the issue, and we know nothing about this, about, of course, like, the best troops being in the front ranks normally, and the others sort of being lighter. You see that wherever also there are so few but heavily armored knights, and then so many other horse archers, like, also the consistency of the average guy is lower, that, as we've seen among the more compact, homogeneous Frankish cavalry by numbers, right? And so this would be partially reflected also by this local Arab population. Most Ahdath infantrymen were from, in fact, the Arab communities, the Arab militias of some cities in northern Syria and the Jazeera. And again, like, this would be Aleppo and Mosul, Damascus, etc. Every city would have had the same type of organization fundamentally. Just again, we don't know how homogeneous this was across all these centers. But, as we hinted at before, these infantries would have surely included, in a more or less formal way, also outer elements, right? Where they were putting the units together, like, they didn't probably even care, like, whether, especially the guys from the posterior ranks, were other types of troopers. And so there were Kurds, Turks, without mentioning that, again, there were, again, the Greeks as well, like the Byzantines. This is yet the other point that we're making at the beginning, had left, of course, urban culture with some important level of militia organization. This was true in general also in the Islamic world, aside from the advance, or so the back and forth of the frontier with the Byzantine Empire, which of course means that there wasn't such a radical ethnic divide. Like, if you could find the same Ahdath of one town in Syria, like, of course, all these ethnic groups. Of course, the Syrian one would have been prevalent on average by extraction. Then, of course, there would have been, at that point, war bands of Kurds or Turks, mostly under the Ayyubid or the Seljukid leadership, and that really counted something different. Likely they were arrayed differently from the Ahdath. The overall, like, battle lines deployments are not that very well known. They would have formed, of course, however, a single line, and it would have not been a particular complexity about different depths of infantry, because most of the army was cavalry, and so all the infantry together, but say the Ahdath from one side of the line, and these other tribal elements of Turks, Kurds, and also God knows how many other people from God knows where, would have just been next to them, or in some cases next to them. It depends really also on how the local community would accept to just this guys within their ranks to strengthen their own force. If you think about it, and you were sort of a war bander out there, we've seen, again, remember the etymology of the same Ahdath, like joining, for example, like a more sedentary lifestyle, and being hired by the same local cities to participate to the local defense, like, could have made you enter in the Ahdath itself. After all, we've seen they received some money for that. So if there were people who were just better at the others, not cutting throats and torturing, etc. Of course, it would have been the best ones, right? People kill others who were not really, they don't give a damn about human life. They're perfect, and this is really the spirit when you hire soldiery. And in this sense, there would have been some gradual integration across the generations. It sort of makes sense. Being largely Syrian, these troops would have been armed with spear and or sword. We definitely see javelins and bows, and sometimes even crossbows, especially in the later period, prominently featuring in the sources at our disposal. This makes a lot of sense. It also tells you more about that degree of non-citizenry homogeneity that we're talking about. It tells you about less affluence compared, say, to a Western communal guy from the richest centers in the world. The fact that somebody uses the javelin, for example, it's not like that between, say, in the 11th century, an Italian militia, say, would have not used javelins, but it's not something that really appears that frequently in the sources. The West was developing some sort of tougher, bulkier, more armored infantries that were truly like a melee, like, say, man walls, to oppose, to cavalry in a successful way. And so, regardless of some developments in the art of war, I mean, still by the time of Hastings, the same knights not just dismounted often, but they used the javelin also from horseback to soften up the enemy lines before charging into them. Later on, again, these would have become truly tougher, and instead we see throughout this 11th, 13th century maybe surely a process of toughening of these Ahdath infantries, regardless of the success of their polities in terms of their liberty. Actually, they could be taken over, as we've seen by the Seljuks, and gradually sort of a bit brought under between the 13th and 14th century. Things get really worse for anyone involved. But still finding so prominently javelins, for example, is not just the great indicator of robustness of an infantry at this point. It sort of makes sense, of course, for the environment. It's not to say that they weren't ineffective in this context. They were the first ones to go out to war perfectly knowing whether something was useful or not, how to dose their energies, how these weapons would have served them. There was a lot of missile warfare involved, so javelins were dangerous weapons, right? They were also effective against armor, and we also in siege warfare, never underestimate that. The javelins very often caused properly claimed victims among the men-at-arms, the stormtroopers during sieges. We see bows as well. Crossbows seems to have been less popular here than in Europe, right? In Europe, basically by the 13th century, say almost everything has homogenized heavily in favor of the crossbow, right? There are bows. Then, of course, we know better of the English longbowmen, but those were a bit of an exception in Europe. Like universally, in fact, also in this Levantine world, like it's the crossbow that takes over, but it's not as let's say, and especially among the infantry. Of course, among the horsemen, it's the bow that remains, also for practical reasons. But in that specific context of the art of war, whereas the urban communities were a bit more mechanized, as we've seen, and would have more likely used a crossbow. I think it's fair to say, even without actual quantitative evidence, that most of the local militia missile men would fight with a crossbow. And then, of course, there are crossbows and crossbows, right? We don't seem here to have a major crossbow technology development compared to what was happening in the West. Again, this is also normal. Contextualize it in this in the local type of warfare. That's so much archery that to an extent you had to adapt to that, and or to also equip yourself in ways that would make you lighter, for example, which is not something you have to underestimate. Consequently, as we were saying before, also arms and armor were lighter. It's likely that these guys didn't have this enormous protection. Some of them would have gone at war without even just some padded garment. You see a turban, probably some more resistant footwear for like campaign. Like these guys weren't expected to be out of their houses that long, right? If they were supported logistically by them, but also by like a bigger army, including by looters, right, of the horse archery type, again, come from the steppes. And they would have had, again, their stocks, their warehouses, when they kept also, as we've seen, part of their siege machinery. The fact that, yes, there could be a sword in their armament is significant, because it actually points to the higher than average affluence of the average Ahdath individual compared to like the outer person out there. So these were most likely just the people living in the country, in the city. Anyhow, the most important weapon was definitely the spear, right? And we can imagine, of course, a type of of combat that included, of course, mostly like this shields / spear walls that were aimed at, like, with this larger shields, probably that were, we don't know, probably also kneeling or something like that. If I think about all those terrible horse archers, arrow showers, like in keeping the enemy horses at distance with these spears. Again, this type of fighter would have not, it's not to be conceived again of this incredibly massively compact, courageous, unbreakable infantry. But again, for the average horse archer, it was pretty dangerous, right? That's what I was talking about before when making a comparison with the development of Western infantries. Western infantries had to cope with regularly with not just a lot of missile fire from their own counterparts, but with this traumatically shocking cavalry charges. These guys would have faced them too. Surely we can think of some Ahdath even successfully resisting here and there to heavier cavalry charges for a while, right? And we don't see, again, infantry victories that worth of noting, or especially we don't have any detail to catch whether there was something of this kind. But definitely against the lighter horsemen, these guys were effective, and that's how much as they had to be. Right? Again, these were also men, as we've seen, defending their farms from monarchies, etc. That would have been the average, right? If there was some lord, some major, massive Seljuk Persian knight, like they would have likely not wanted to face him in the first place. But who knows? Like, if somebody's angry, like it's not even about what kind of armament they have. They just want to rip the other person's guts off. Anything can really happen. And of course, there would have been a minimal degree of combined arms tactics. I mean, surely the stopping infantry cooperated heavily with the missile one, and this was especially important for fencing off and to respond properly to the horse archers. So that much is actually the case. I was saying before, like, probably there were some, here we see the round shield in the model, but there would have been also other types of weapons of shields that we mentioned, the Genoese one before, and so these guys would have been receptive also of some Western military input, right? For a long time, the saying was that during the Crusades, the Westerners began to take stuff from the East that was so much more advanced. Actually, I've studied the thing for decades now. There is no evidence of that whatsoever. If anything, the opposite is true. Like some techniques, yes, some technologies even, but it's not like say weapons, infantry, in this case as a whole, would have actually had anything in Europe to learn from the Middle Eastern ones. If anything, we see these Middle Easterners confronting themselves with these heavier enemies, also starting to buy Western weapons. Remember that here, I don't know, in the 13th, 14th century Ilkhanate, next door there were Frankish horsemen and Italian marines that were being hired as mercenaries. So it's not like the system was accidentally in contact with the West just because of the Crusades. We've seen it in the videos about the Mamluks as well. Like there was a massive Western influence in arms and armor that is actually greater than the one we see coming from the East, surely existing in Europe, no doubt. So regarding again the hand-to-hand combat, there were these wars, there were these shields. At least if you look at the model I posited here, you would imagine them knowing how this is sort of the good type, like the sort of, maybe not fully average in fact, but one had slightly more capacity and reason and motivation and knew how to use a sword and a spear and a shield together, and that's something you appreciate from a type of trooper that has some minimal, like it's not just like the vanilla guy, levy militiaman taken from nowhere just with a, I don't know, wicker shield and a spear. This is something more. It's something more developed and would have likely formed like the first ranks of this of these formations. Of course, it would have been, as we were saying before, sort of armored infantrymen within these ranks and also in the fore, but it would have been, I don't know, the NCOs would have, like leaders from the city would have had something like that, but say we don't see this as a substantially homogeneous characteristic. Archery would have been learned, if you want, also say more. It would have been more common also because of this need of, especially the rural levies, to counter horse archery. So that's also why it would have been expandably there. The majority of the majority of the Ahdath were heavy, so that they could sort of stand their ground against missile and other, say, heavy troops. But of course, they could resort to such missile capacity when needed, and probably, like in the organization, this was prearranged, but it would have not been strange to find one sort of hastily levied, in fact, militiaman just bringing his bow with him, even when he had a spear and a shield, because you may never know what may happen. And still, again, this would have been not really an untypical, in fact, a kind of fighter in these contexts. It's the picture is all blurred, but we kind of have this overall indications, tendencies, and we're therefore able to trace this picture. Again, we will talk in other videos about the type of archers that were around, the crossbowmen. There is all like the technicality, the military engineers, the nafa throwers, that's interesting as well. Of course, we will get into it. This was, however, just about this humble spearman, as you see here, with some, maybe at least the one in the picture, some extra or urban background basis that could allow him to know how to use a sword decently. Remember that it's not until the 14th century that, let's say, an average person of this status could really buy a sword without too much problems, right? It would have not been uncommon in the 13th century. This is a guy from the 13th century, let's say. But remember that this Islamic militias were sort of lighter anyway, so but what we see in the West. So even though there were things going in parallel in these various cultures, still it's a trend. It's not really the absolute degree by which this existed. Right? There would be perhaps lots of other things to say that we will do in the videos about the army organization or the local powers at some point regarding, for example, how were these guys connected, for example, with the defensive duties of certain fortifications. They would have not just been city ones, presumably. There would have been towns that had different fortifications around the district and sent troops to control them. There were, of course, lords in the countryside as well, so all kind of interesting things going on that unfortunately we can't document quite too well, right? But probably again, especially in for the larger cities, there was probably an administration, a bureaucracy deputed to distribute such militia forces also for the garrisoning of this or that castle. This would have not been untypical. Like this could have easily fenced off some of the more frequent raids that existed. This kind of broader frontier that existentially was. So these communities would have just organized themselves accordingly from a military point of view. But that's again something that here we don't take to consideration. It pertains to another dimension of warfare. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.